Most of us grew up hearing the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, a magical musician who lured rats away from a German town with his enchanted flute, only to take terrible revenge when the townspeople refused to pay him. In our childhood imaginations, we pictured a whimsical figure in colourful clothing, leading vermin to their watery doom before spiriting away the town's children in an act of supernatural vengeance. But what if I told you that this isn't just a fairy tale? What if the Pied Piper of Hamelin is actually based on one of the most disturbing and unexplained mass disappearances in medieval history? A real event so traumatic that it scarred an entire community for generations, leaving behind cryptic records that historians are still trying to decipher more than 700 years later. The truth behind the Pied Piper is far more chilling than any children's story. It involves 130 missing young people, a conspiracy of silence that lasted for centuries, and theories that range from medieval human trafficking to mass murder. This isn't the sanitized version you learned as a child. This is the real story of what happened in the German town of Hamelin on June 26, 1284. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of legend and examine the historical evidence that suggests something genuinely horrific occurred in medieval Germany. We'll explore the dark theories that historians have proposed, from plague victims being led to mass graves to young people being sold into slavery. We'll investigate the possibility that the Pied Piper was actually a recruitment agent for a brutal colonization effort, or perhaps something even more sinister. The story of the Pied Piper has endured for over 7 centuries, but not because it's a charming fairy tale. It has endured because it represents one of history's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a mass disappearance that was so disturbing the survivors could only speak of it in metaphors and coded language. The colourful Piper of legend may have been a symbol for something far more terrifying: organised child abduction, human trafficking, or even ritualistic murder. What makes this case particularly unsettling is the consistency of the historical records. This wasn't a story that grew in the telling. The basic facts have remained remarkably stable across centuries of documentation. 130 young people vanished on a specific date, following a mysterious figure in colourful clothing. They were never seen again. Their families mourned them for generations. And the town of Hamelin has never forgotten. The Brothers Grimm, Robert Browning, and countless other storytellers have romanticized this tale, turning it into a moral lesson about keeping promises and paying debts. But the real story is about something much darker, a medieval mystery that involves mass disappearance, possible human trafficking, and a cover-up that may have involved the highest levels of church and state. As we dive deeper into this investigation, prepare yourself for a journey into medieval Germany's darkest secrets. The Pied Piper wasn't a magical musician, he was something far more frightening. And what happened to those 130 young people in 1284 might be one of the most disturbing crimes in European history. Chapter 2. Let's start with what we know for certain. On June 26, 1284, something catastrophic happened in the German town of Hamelin. This isn't speculation or folklore, it's documented historical fact, recorded by the townspeople themselves and preserved in multiple independent sources that span centuries. The earliest evidence comes from a stained glass window that was installed in Hamelin's market church around 1300. This window, which survived until 1660 before being destroyed, depicted a figure in multicolored clothing leading children away from the town. But this wasn't created as decoration, it was a memorial, a permanent reminder of a tragedy that the community couldn't forget. Multiple written accounts describe this window in detail. According to these sources, it showed a youth appeared and played on a strange silver flute. Every child that heard the flute followed the stranger. They left Hamelin by the eastern gate and disappeared at Calvarian Hill. This is the oldest known account of the incident, created just 16 years after the alleged event by people who may have witnessed it firsthand. Even more chilling is a verse written in red ink on the title page of a missal from the same period, which bewails the 130 beloved Hamelner children who were eaten alive by Calvaria, a haunting phrase that suggests something far more sinister than the sanitized fairy tale version we know today. The town records of Hamelin provide perhaps the most disturbing evidence. In 1384, exactly 100 years after the incident, the town's chronicle contains the grimly simple entry, "It is 100 years since our children left." This wasn't written as folklore or legend, it was recorded as historical fact in official municipal documents. Think about the implications of this entry. A century had passed, and the townspeople were still mourning this loss. They weren't commemorating a myth or a legend, They were marking the anniversary of a real tragedy that had shaped their community's identity for 4 generations. The Lüneburg manuscript, written around 1440 to 1450, provides even more specific details. In the year of 1284, on the day of Saints John and Paul on June 26, by a piper, clothed in many kinds of colours, 130 children born in Hamelin were seduced and lost at the place of execution near the Koppen. That phrase, place of execution, is particularly disturbing. Why would a medieval chronicler use such specific, ominous language unless something genuinely horrific had occurred? This wasn't describing a magical disappearance or a journey to a better place. This was describing what sounds like mass murder. The town of Hamelin itself still bears physical evidence of this tragedy. The Rattenfänger house, or rat catcher's house, bears an inscription that reads, AD 1284, on the 26th of June, the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children, born in Hamelin, were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicolored clothes. After passing the Calvary near the Koppenberg, they disappeared forever. There's also the matter of Bungalowsenstrasse, the street without drums. This is the street where the children were allegedly last seen, and to this day no one is allowed to play music or dance there. This isn't a quaint tourist attraction, it's a permanent memorial to a real tragedy, maintained by a community that has never forgotten what happened there. What makes this evidence particularly compelling is its consistency across multiple independent sources and centuries. The date is always the same, June 26, 1284. The number is always the same, 130 young people. The basic story is always the same. They followed a figure in colourful clothing and were never seen again. This consistency is crucial because medieval chroniclers weren't known for their accuracy when recording folklore or legends. Stories grew and changed in the telling. Details became exaggerated, numbers became inflated, but the Pied Piper story remains remarkably stable across all historical sources. This suggests we're not dealing with folklore that evolved over time. We're dealing with the record of a real event that was so traumatic, the basic facts were burned into the community's collective memory. Even more telling is what's missing from the early accounts. The rats don't appear in the story until the 16th century, more than 250 years after the alleged incident. The earliest accounts of the story don't include the rats, which wouldn't show up until around the year 1559. This suggests that the rat-catching element was a later addition, possibly added to make the story more palatable or to create a moral lesson about keeping promises. The original story was much simpler and much more disturbing. A mysterious figure in colourful clothing appeared in Hamelin, lured away 130 young people, and they were never seen again. No magical flute, no unpaid debts, no moral lesson. Just mass disappearance and grieving families. Professor Jürgen Udolf, a linguistics expert who has extensively studied this case, has verified that 130 children did vanish on a June day in the year 1284 from the German village of Hamelin. This isn't folklore, it's historical fact supported by multiple lines of evidence. So we know something terrible happened in Hamelin on June 26, 1284. 130 young people vanished following a mysterious figure, and they were never seen again. The question isn't whether this happened, the historical record is too consistent and too well documented to doubt. The question is what really happened to them, and why their disappearance was so traumatic that it created one of Europe's most enduring legends. Chapter 3. The Dark Theories. What really happened to the children? Now that we've established that something genuinely horrific occurred in Hamelin in 1284, let's examine the theories historians have proposed to explain this mass disappearance. Each theory is more disturbing than the last, painting a picture of medieval Europe far darker than most imagine. The death theory, mass murder. One of the most chilling theories suggests the Pied Piper was actually a personification of death itself, and the 130 young people were victims of mass murder or catastrophic accident. This gains credibility from the language used in medieval accounts. The Lüneburg manuscript specifically mentions the place of execution near the Koppen, hardly language for peaceful departure. Some historians believe the young people were victims of a landslide or natural disaster in the hills near Hamelin. Others suggest they drowned attempting to cross a river. But the most disturbing possibility is deliberate killing, possibly ritual sacrifice or medieval ethnic cleansing. The fact that bodies were never found doesn't disprove this theory. Medieval Europe was violent and mass graves were common. the dense forests around Hamelin would have provided plenty of disposal opportunities. The phrase, "eaten alive by Calvaria," in early accounts could describe violent death rather than magical disappearance. The plague theory, disease and quarantine. Another theory connects the disappearance to disease. While the Black Death came later, medieval Europe suffered various plagues, and 1284 could have seen an equally devastating outbreak. If the young people showed infection signs, they might have been led away to prevent contamination, a medieval quarantine that turned deadly. This becomes more sinister considering possible biological warfare. Medieval armies used diseased corpses as weapons, catapulting plague victims over city walls. Could the Pied Piper have deliberately infected Hamelin's youth, then led them away to die in isolation? The Children's Crusade theory, religious manipulation. Another theory speculates the children were participants in a doomed children's crusade. The Children's Crusade of 1212 was one of medieval history's most disturbing episodes, where thousands of young people were convinced to march to the Holy Land to peacefully convert Muslims to Christianity. The traditional narrative involves visions by a French and German boy, an intention to peacefully convert Muslims, bands of children marching to Italy, and children being sold into slavery in Tunis. Many died en route or were sold by merchants who promised transport. The parallels to the Pied Piper story are striking. Both involve charismatic figures convincing large numbers of young people to follow them on journeys they'd never return from. Both center on persuasion power and youth vulnerability to manipulation. The Hamelin disappearance could have been a local version, young people convinced to join a religious movement ending in slavery or death. What makes this particularly disturbing is the organized nature. This wasn't spontaneous religious fervor, it was systematic manipulation by adults who knew exactly what they were doing. The human trafficking theory, medieval slavery. Perhaps the most disturbing theory is that the Pied Piper was actually a human trafficker, and the 130 young people were sold into slavery. This gains credibility when examining what was happening in medieval Europe during this period. The 13th century saw massive population movements driven by wars, colonization efforts, and economic opportunities, but evidence suggests something more sinister than parental desperation. The organized nature, specific date, large number of victims, complete absence of survivors suggests a planned operation. Medieval Europe had extensive human trafficking networks specializing in acquiring young people for domestic slavery, sexual exploitation, military service, or dangerous labor in mines and quarries. A trafficker delivering 130 healthy young people would have been extremely valuable to buyers across Europe. The colorful clothing mentioned in all accounts might have been deception. Traffickers often posed as entertainers, merchants, or religious figures to gain community trust. The piper might have used music and performance to cover his real purpose, acquiring targets for human trafficking. The colonization theory, forced migration. The most academically accepted theory suggests the Pied Piper incident connected to medieval colonization efforts in Eastern Europe. Professor Jürgen Udolph's research is genuinely disturbing. He found Hamelin family names occur with amazing frequency in regions of Prignitz and Uckermark, both north of Berlin, and in former Pomeranian regions now in Poland. This genealogical evidence suggests Hamelin people did reach these regions, but circumstances were likely far from voluntary. There were characters known as locators who roamed northern Germany recruiting settlers for the East. Some were brightly dressed, all were silver-tongued, medieval recruitment agents whose methods were often coercive and deceptive. Young people recruited for colonization faced brutal conditions. They cleared forests, built settlements, and defended territory from hostile neighbors in frontier regions. Many died from disease, violence, or exposure. Survivors often found themselves in virtual slavery, bound to landowners controlling every aspect of their lives. The timing fits perfectly. The Battle of Bornhoft broke Danish hold on regions previously occupied by Slavs, opening them for German colonization. There's historical evidence of systematic efforts to recruit able-bodied youths for Brandenburg and Pomerania. What makes this particularly disturbing is the organized, systematic nature. This wasn't desperate families sending children away. This was organized exploitation by medieval corporations and government entities viewing them as expendable resources. The locators used every manipulation tool available: promises of wealth, appeals to religious duty, threats of punishment, and sophisticated psychological techniques. They were accompanied by drummers and pipers in bright theatrical clothes. These recruiters looked like entertainers. Most disturbing, Hamelin's families may have been complicit. If the town faced economic hardship, local authorities might have made deals with locators, trading young people for debt relief or economic incentives. The grief in later town documents might not have been just sorrow, it might have been guilt. Each theory paints medieval Europe as far darker than most imagine, whether the Pied Piper represents death, disease, religious manipulation, human trafficking, or forced colonization. The story is ultimately about systematic exploitation and destruction of vulnerable young people by adults, viewing them as expendable resources. Chapter 4. The Truth Behind the Legend. Why this horror story became a fairy tale. After examining all the historical evidence and theories, we're left with a disturbing conclusion. The Pied Piper of Hamelin wasn't a fairy tale that became associated with historical events. It was a historical atrocity that was transformed into a fairy tale to make it more palatable for future generations. This transformation reveals something deeply unsettling about how societies deal with collective trauma. When something too horrible to face directly happens to a community, they often preserve the memory in coded, symbolic language that allows them to remember the event without confronting its full horror. The cover-up. Why the truth was hidden. The most likely scenario is that the Pied Piper incident involved organized human trafficking or forced recruitment for colonization, possibly with local authority complicity. This explains several puzzling aspects of the historical record. First, why the story was recorded but not explained. If local officials made deals with locators or human traffickers, trading the town's young people for economic benefits, they couldn't openly record this in official documents. But they couldn't simply forget such trauma. The solution was recording it in symbolic, mythologized language that preserved basic facts while obscuring shameful details. Second, the long-term community grief. Parents still deeply mourning their children's loss 100 years later, but unable to be completely open about what happened, suggests complicity in their loss. If parents had been pressured or incentivized to give up their children, they would carry not just grief but guilt that would make the loss even harder to bear. Third, why church and state authorities allowed the story's preservation. Medieval authorities usually suppressed unwanted information effectively. The Pied Piper story's survival in official records, church windows, and town chronicles suggest it served some purpose, likely deterrence. By preserving it as a cautionary tale about breaking promises and not paying debts, authorities could reinforce social compliance. The message was clear: honor your agreements with authority figures or face terrible consequences. The evolution. How horror became fantasy. The transformation from historical atrocity to children's fairy tale was gradual, involving several layers of revision and sanitization. The first layer was temporal. As generations passed, immediate trauma faded and the story became symbolic. People who hadn't lived through the original event found it easier to interpret metaphorically rather than literally. The second layer was religious. Medieval church authorities reframed traumatic events as divine will or moral lessons. The Pied Piper story became a parable about greed consequences and keeping promises to God's representatives. The third layer was literary. As the story spread beyond Hamelin, storytellers added entertaining, less disturbing elements. The rats were probably added during this phase, providing logical reason for the Piper's presence and making his revenge seem justified. The fourth layer was commercial. As literacy spread and printed books became popular, publishers found fairy tales sold well. The Pied Piper story was sanitized further for children's literature, removing disturbing elements to become a simple moral tale about keeping promises. What we've lost. Today's version bears little resemblance to the historical events it was based on. We've lost memory of what was actually a significant atrocity, the systematic exploitation and probable death of 130 young people from a single community. This loss matters because it obscures our understanding of medieval history and ordinary people's realities. Medieval Europe wasn't romantic fantasy, it was brutal and dangerous, where human trafficking, forced labor, and mass exploitation were common and often government-sanctioned. The Pied Piper incident wasn't unique. Similar disappearances probably occurred throughout medieval Europe, but most weren't as well documented. By sanitizing this story, we've lost sight of systematic violence characterizing medieval society and ordinary people's vulnerability to exploitation. Why this story endures. The Pied Piper story has endured over 700 years because it touches fundamental fears transcending historical periods. Every society fears losing its children, and every generation worries about charismatic figures who might lead the young astray. But persistence serves a darker purpose. By transforming historical atrocity into moral fable, we avoid confronting uncomfortable reality that similar atrocities continue. Human trafficking, forced migration, and exploitation of vulnerable young people didn't end in the Middle Ages. They continue today in forms recognizable to medieval Hamelin's people. Modern versions of locators still exist, their recruiters promising desperate families their children will have better lives elsewhere, only to sell them into slavery. They're extremist groups radicalizing vulnerable youth to leave families for causes likely to destroy them. They're criminal organizations exploiting economic desperation to acquire human resources. The real lesson. The true story isn't about keeping promises or paying debts. It's about community vulnerability under economic stress and the ease with which those in power exploit that vulnerability for their own purposes. Hamelin's people in 1284 probably faced economic hardship, political instability, or both. Into this came someone offering what seemed like a solution, perhaps economic relief in exchange for some young people, or promises of better opportunities elsewhere. The tragedy isn't just that 130 young people disappeared, it's that their community may have been complicit. The long-term grief suggests not just mourning but guilt, collective shame from knowing they failed to protect their most vulnerable members. This pattern repeats throughout history. Communities under stress become vulnerable to exploitation, and exploiters often target the young, those with most to lose and least power to resist. The real lesson isn't about individual morality, it's about collective responsibility. It's about communities needing to protect their most vulnerable members, even when those in power offer seemingly attractive deals for their exploitation. The story has survived 7 centuries, not because it's charming, but because it represents truth about human nature and social vulnerability remaining relevant today. The Pipers are still among us, still playing their silver flutes, still promising solutions to our problems in exchange for our children. The question isn't whether we'll encounter them, it's whether we'll recognize them when they arrive, and whether we'll have courage to say no, even when saying yes seems easier. The children of Hamelin have been gone over 700 years, but their story continues warning us about the price of looking away when the vulnerable need protection. In transforming their tragedy into fairy tale, we've honored their memory the only way medieval society knew how, ensuring their story would never be forgotten, even if its full horror would never be fully understood.